Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Rusty Buckets and welcome back to Hot Takes. It has been quite a while since we have done Hot Takes because there's been a whole bunch of trade deadline shenanigans. But with that said, we're just going to go ahead and get right into it. Check out my third channel for some extra content over there. Not sure what's being posted today. Oh, yes, I am sure what's being posted today. Our Discord hot takes as well. We have a Discord where we discuss basketball and we're doing some fan-generated content over there. So if you would like to join that Discord, all you have to do is join our Patreon and you get instant access. Lots of fun basketball conversations over there, some good people. So yeah, with that said, let's go ahead and get into today's hot takes. From Stan Blankard, the Luka trade is huge, but will change absolutely nothing. Mavs will stay competent and will be reaching around the conference finals for 2 to 4 years, but won't win anything and will come back to mid until they high roll on the next S-tier big / slow middle European dude. Lakers will be stuck in the LeBron plus a great player and maybe some solid dudes picked up by pure luck. They will never rebuild, will take another superstar after Bron is gone, and continue to be B-tier contenders for 10 years and win nothing. This trade exists purely to be stupid, annoy Mavericks fans, and be stupid. All right, so let's first take this assessment from the Mavericks point about them just being a competent conference finals level team for 2 to 4 years. So obviously you're suggesting that by this changing nothing, that's the direction that the Mavericks were going to be going in. And it's hard to disagree with you on that with the OKC Thunder and obviously Victor Wembanyama's Spurs right around the corner. I do think the West will be more competitive than it was when the Mavericks made the finals last year, but I don't think it was by any means a guarantee that they were not going to see a finals appearance over the next 2 to 4 years, but it did seem less likely than I would have thought after they made it last year. So if you want to make the argument that they're just going to be in that tier for a couple of years, and if they had Luka, they were going to be in that tier for a couple of years, and then Luka was going to be traded anyways because the timeline of that just would have made sense. I get where you're coming from. I also don't think that I would make such a strong, confident bet on the future of the NBA, especially with the basis being around a guy who is a top 3 player in the NBA. So with that said, moving on to the Lakers aspect of things, they will be stuck in the LeBron plus a great player and maybe solid dudes picked by pure luck. You're making the argument that this is a cycle we've seen before. I would say that the LeBron aspect of this is not the leading thing. The LeBron plus a great player thing is LeBron plus the second best player on the team being a great player, but LeBron is the second best player on this team. He is very much the B option next to Luka, so I don't think that's really the framing we should use on this. It's a new thing that LeBron is involved in, but LeBron is no longer the guy making the top shots. That was made abundantly clear based on all the reporting of the original deal. So they won't rebuild because they're going to have a superstar Luka Doncic, so there's no reason for them to never rebuild. Also, you say it will take another superstar after LeBron is gone. If they can get another superstar and pair him next to Luka Doncic, I definitely think that moves them beyond the B-tier contender category because, well, I get where you're coming from. Luka hasn't had a superstar teammate. Kyrie Irving is the closest thing he's gotten to that or Kristaps Porzingis. We're talking about a player who has not had a fellow top 10 player as his teammate before. Honestly, you could argue LeBron is still top 10. I don't know. He's definitely on the precipice. He's definitely in that like 7 to 15 range where you can kind of change up the players on any given day. But one way or the other, Luka has never had another superstar teammate. So if you tell me that they get another superstar after LeBron is gone and continue to be B-tier contenders for 10 years and win nothing, to me, that's crazy. If you put Luka and another superstar in the same team, I'm not going to confidently say all that's going to come of that is being B-tier contenders and falling short every year. I think that is overly zealous, overly confident. I think Luka is the type of player that you just say, if you have him, it's possible to win. It is possible to win as long as you just do a decent enough job building that team around him. Obviously, the Mavericks got a conference finals and eventual finals appearance out of that very mentality. You know, the Dallas Mavericks in 2024 were not some super stacked team. It was Kyrie Irving, who is a really good second option, and then just a bunch of pretty good role players. Nothing more significant than that, and that got them a finals appearance. So maybe what comes of this is the Mavericks are okay for a bit, and then they're not, which is the direction that maybe the Mavericks were going anyways. But on the Lakers end of things, I just can't agree that this is going to result in just mediocrity or, you know, being a B-tier level contending team for a long time. I just don't see that. So I'm going to have to disagree with your take there, but thank you for giving me a very good title take. This comment from Nick Miller saying, I paused my Norm Macdonald compilation to watch this. Love that comment. It's not a take, but Norm Macdonald is one of the GOATs. From Tomian, firing head coaches happen so easily because most of the coaches don't have schemes. They run plays that mathematically generate the most points. So by firing a coach that's not a big name like Pop, Tibbs, or Spo, teams don't lose much and would rather keep their players happy. So the argument here is that the difference between most coaches is ultimately not that discernible, so having guys coming in and out doesn't actually matter that much. I don't know about that. I think you are oversimplifying it. And I can personally attest as a Chicago Bulls fan to the type of awful shit that can happen when you have a bad coach. Not just, you know, if you're making the argument a mid coach is a mid coach is a mid coach, what does it really matter? You're not guaranteed to get a mid coach, just like you're not guaranteed to get a good one. Sometimes I've definitely made the argument against being okay with mediocrity, but coaching is one of those things that you can't accept that if you have the right personnel on the team. But I'm just not quite with you on it being so simple as there only being a couple of guys that are irreplaceable. There's I also feel like the confidence in the consistency of the replacement being just the right thing to do. Is that the right thing to do, or is that just what teams do? You know, maybe there are coaches that would be great if given a little bit more opportunity to actually figure shit out having that job, and then they aren't given that opportunity because teams are so happy to fire coaches all the time. Fucking Kenny Atkinson got fired. Kenny Atkinson got fired because he was a mid coach, and then now he's going to win fucking coach of the year. And maybe if the Nets weren't stupid and didn't just abide to what Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving wanted, then they could have avoided having mid coaches again for years after that. So gonna have to disagree with you there. All right, from Brett Varley, Damian Lillard will be remembered the same way Carmelo Anthony is remembered when looking back at his game and career. A great player in their prime, good offensive players that were fun to watch but terrible on the defensive end, fairly one-note players. In the end, their game didn't impact winning championships, all or little impact. Well, if I can give Damian Lillard one thing over Carmelo Anthony, he kept the Portland Trail Blazers competitive for a decade. Like when the LaMarcus Aldridge to the Spurs move, Nick Batum to the Hornets, Wes Matthews to the Mavericks, Robin Lopez to the Knicks, I want to say. But everybody on his team just abandoned him over the course of one offseason. He had this young player, CJ McCollum, who had like a half a good playoff series, who was now his starting two guard and his number one option after himself. And he led the Blazers to the playoffs year after year after year after year without having so much as an all-star teammate. Meanwhile, Carmelo Anthony, when you look at his history as the lead option on a team, there were a couple of years where he made it with the Denver Nuggets, and then 2 years where the Knicks made it with him there. Let me actually just go ahead and pull up his basketball reference real quick just to refresh my memory, but I believe there were 2 years where the Knicks made it. Yep. Yeah, 2012 they made it. So this is, or no, that's 3 years. So they made it in the year where he got traded there, made it and got a first round exit in 2012. And then there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years in Denver where he was consistently getting into the playoffs. I would argue Denver actually did have better help than Dame had over that stretch, but this is actually longer than I would have guessed. He also had that 1 year in 2009 where he got them all the way to the conference finals to lose to the Lakers. And I believe Dame also has that 1 year where he got them to the conference finals and they lost to the Golden State Warriors. But yeah, this is a pretty similar track record all in all, so I guess there's actually not that big of a difference now that I'm looking at it. I think there is also a little bit of a difference just from the positional aspect of it, which I guess that can go both ways depending on who you're talking to. There would be people who are critical of him for being a shoot-first point guard. I don't believe in that mentality, but I do understand it. But I also believe the point guard position is one where it is more acceptable to be all offense. If there's any position where it's acceptable to just be an all offense guy, it is point guard, because you're the smallest person on the floor. You're inherently just going to have a lower level of impact. It's not a guarantee that you can't be a very impactful defensive player being smaller, but it certainly makes it less likely. Meanwhile, Carmelo Anthony is a forward. He literally played power forward at points in his career and not a good defender at all. I think that is worse. I think on top of that, Damian Lillard's a much better distributor than Carmelo Anthony is. I also think Damian Lillard had a play style as a scorer that was more conducive to winning than Carmelo Anthony. The mid-post face-up shit that Carmelo Anthony did, very of his era, so it's not like it wasn't working, but I much prefer the ball-handling scorer who's a good playmaker over the ISO face-up mid-range scorer who isn't a good playmaker and then also isn't a good defender. So, I don't know. I think Dame at his peak is a little bit better than Carmelo Anthony personally. But also, your overall sentiment just being, offensive superstar that didn't have the best play style to impact winning championships, didn't really have the right opportunity to do that at any point, and was probably more destined to be a second option. And, that's where Dame is right now. Maybe Dame will get a championship before his career is said and done, or maybe he won't, and it'll be a very similar thing to Carmelo Anthony. So all that yapping, I'm ultimately walking around to I agree with your take. All right, this take is long, but I think it'll be worth it. From Harbing. An underdiscussed part of the manufactured three-point hate is the fear that older players and older fans have about being surpassed and forgotten. 15 years ago, just before the three-point revolution, I remembered hearing someone say the line, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game, and he did it without the three-point line. It didn't matter that 1962 was a way higher scoring environment than 2010, or that Wilt was a post-up big and not a high-volume perimeter jump shooter, or that most of the great scorers of the 2000s were still taking pretty low volume of threes. It just mattered that Wilt didn't have a three-point line. In a similar vein, many of Michael Jordan's mega scoring seasons happened in the fast-paced 80s, but a certain contingent of fans pretend that his entire career was in the slower 1990s and say that unlike, say, LeBron, he didn't have the advantage of normalized high-volume three-point shooters to, quote, pad his stats. While era adjustment is always on the forefront of all-time debates, and three-pointers are a large part of era adjustment, not enough people are honest and explicit about how the reason they hate three-pointers is just because threes make number bigger. People pretend that it's about aesthetics when it's mostly about narratives. By the way, this isn't a knock on Chamberlain or Jordan or to say that LeBron is better, just an observation about fans who I think are disingenuous. So there is layers to this, and you're completely right about the lost in the past aspect of things. As the game becomes something so different from what it was a long time ago, older basketball becomes entirely unfamiliar, and it almost, unfortunately, comes off as more primitive. And, if we're just looking at it from the guise of evolution, in that way it is, but at the same time, that would make basketball now primitive in 20 years. My mentality has always been that I enjoy the game in its many forms, and I like the evolutionary aspect of things, but there are other people who go, well, if human now instead of monkey, then no longer are monkey that cool. I don't have that mentality. Monkeys are sick, dude. I love monkeys. But evolutionarily, if you watch 1990s basketball and you're used to 2020s basketball, you're going to go, this is just a less advanced, less smart, less impressive version of basketball than what I know now. And that is a scary thought for the players of that era. And I also think the difference, the contrast, is more dramatic than it ever was. You highlight the 80s era being higher paced. You highlight Wilt not having a three-point line, not really mattering for the type of player he was. All of that stuff is true. But I don't think a lot of people are willing to confront the nature of that, and the difference between play styles from 1960 to 2000 is not that dramatic, but the difference from 2000 to 2020 is very dramatic, more dramatic than any other transitionary phase in NBA history. So I agree that a lot of it is a fear of being lost in the past. I also think it is just this is not the game that I grew up with, the game that I know, therefore I reject it. It really is primarily a generational thing, and yeah, it's kind of always going to be. I do eventually want to make a main channel deep dive video just about generational divide and how it affects the NBA and all that. But yes, this is a great take. Lots of words, but I agree with you. From Benzie T account, saying, oh, you didn't watch X player is not an argument against another player being lower ranked all time. The reality is that a lot of older fans have no access to the internet, couldn't rewind games, and probably weren't a season ticket holder to the Cincinnati Royals. There is full game footage on YouTube of countless Hall of Famers that gives us the frame of reference older fans didn't have access to. Also, seeing a game live, especially in other eras, does not inherently mean your perspective is better. I've been to live NBA games, and it does not mean I understood the game better than someone else who didn't. I actually have always felt as though physically being at the game actually makes you understand the game a little bit less, unless you're like up in the rafters, like getting a full look at the court. The advantage you have in terms of just your point of view from watching an NBA game broadcasted, it's far better for actually understanding what's happening. My experience when I have gone to NBA games is it feels more just like dudes playing basketball than it did before. Like far more just like, oh yeah, this is tangibly human beings that I'm seeing do all this. And you're not seeing the X's and O's aspect of it nearly as well because you're just caught up in the live environment of it all. But what you're saying about like, yeah, these guys, when they're talking about, Michael Jordan's the GOAT, it's like, okay, well, did you watch Kareem? Did you watch Wilt? Did you watch, XYZ player from earlier on? I guarantee you didn't, because you didn't have access to that shit when you were watching Michael Jordan at his peak in the way that you do now. I have seen any guy who's anywhere near all-time great status. I've seen multiple of their games on YouTube. It's not the same experience as having watched at the time, and I think there is, in terms of legacy, it is important to be aware of the cultural zeitgeist at the time, not just to know of it, but to have lived it. I don't think that experience is irrelevant in understanding the impact of a player and their legacy, but it's also not as though you cannot get a synthesized version of that is about as close to reality as you can possibly ask for. So on that front, I agree with you that I don't know. You should watch any player to an extent that you are talking about. There are definitely people who have not watched a moment of Oscar Robertson, and they're like, yeah, he's not top 40. And it's like, well, you just watch some highlights, man. It's not that hard. Yeah, I don't know. I agree with you mostly. From CJ Espinoza, the NBA needs to establish franchises more than individual players. Not saying that they should stop altogether, but this hyperfixation on specific star players leads to the low ratings we've seen between eras, especially when they refuse to move on from the stars of the 2010s. There's a part of me that feels like it would be wise to emphasize the franchise over the individual players, because it's much easier to long-term get invested with a franchise rather than a player, because the players are moving so often that if you're getting caught up in players, you end up being a fan of the player who has, an expiration date on how long they can be, the guy that you really care about. Like, being a Luka Doncic fan is cool, but Luka Doncic isn't going to be playing basketball by 2045. But I bet you the Los Angeles Lakers will be. That is, if we still have, not destroyed the entire world. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. But I agree. The market should be more focused on teams focusing on developing rivalries between those teams. You can't have one without the other, but I definitely think the NBA leans on, like, the conversation of who's the face of the NBA just as an individual basketball player. The NBA originally was built on teams. The face of the league in the 1980s was the Showtime Lakers. That was the face of the league. It wasn't just Magic. It wasn't just Kareem. It helped that there were, charismatic, top-of-the-line stars on those teams, but also the forefront of the conversation was around the franchise. I don't know. You can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but it definitely does feel like there has been an overemphasis on the individual over the franchise. This is an interesting one. I think we'll end the video on this take. From 40 Nights, if Russell Westbrook's 2017 MVP season never happened, then Jason Tatum is at least top 2 in MVP voting in 2024 instead of 6th. The record of a team he's the best player on would have been weighed more heavily as it was before the MVP changed the precedent. I think it is worth mentioning that 2017 Russ is not necessarily the turning point of the MVP discussion, because guys like him have always been a part of the discussion. It's just the narrative in his case plus the numbers were so overwhelming, was kind of hard to ignore. I still to this day believe that the award should have gone to James Harden, because the ultimate difference in their stats was like 1.5 rebounds and like 4 points per game, but a way better efficiency difference in favor of James Harden, and the Rockets had a much better record. So not much better, but better. They were a higher seed. They won over 50 games, which OKC did not. So I do feel as though 2017 Russ was a significant turning point, but I also don't think that Jason Tatum is the type of guy that wins MVP, even when his team is very good. The MVP does not just automatically go to best player, best team. That's not really how it has worked historically. If that was the case, the MVP would look very different. The MVP has, like, I know when Karl Malone won it over Mike, that shit happened when Mike's team had the better record. I think the Bulls won like 69 games and didn't go to Mike because the MVP narrative just wasn't on his side that season. They decided they'd rather give it to a pedophile. So 2017 is a good turning point, but I also think people look at that and idealize it like what it was before. I think people think it was a little more clear cut than it actually was. The MVP has always been a contentious award where there is debate as to who it actually should go to, what the actual qualification should be. It's just that in 2017, we saw this turning point of discourse where, around then is when the internet age is really, really starting to ramp up and affect the discourse of the NBA. And people who had the contrarian opinion that were previously unallowed to share that opinion and unallowed to influence the discussion have since been allowed to, and that is the case now. People campaign. There are fan bases that are campaigning for dudes to win the MVP award very publicly, actively doing like slander campaigns against their opposition, and you just didn't see that energy before, and I think that shifted the MVP discussion more than just simply Russ winning it as the 5th seed or whatever. Big numbers have always mattered, and winning still matters to an extent. You're not going to see someone win MVP without making the playoffs. I remember there was a very loud minority, but still loud, of people who said that Steph Curry should win MVP in like 2022 when the Warriors didn't even end up making the playoffs at all. That type of shit, I'm like, yeah, well, that's just pushing it too far. But just sometimes the guy who's the best player on the best team isn't a strong candidate because either A, he's not just clearly one of the best players in the NBA, because that's not always the case. Like Donovan Mitchell and the Cavs are not. Donovan Mitchell's nowhere near the MVP conversation, because being the best player on the best team in the East does not mean that you are an MVP candidate by default. So yes, I do think the 2017 MVP season changed things, but I also feel like that change was inevitable just because of the landscape of NBA discourse. So yes, you are mostly right. I don't know if he would be top 2, but I get the sentiment you're getting towards. You're mostly right on this one, 40 Nights. All right. Yeah, that's it. Go check out Third Channel. Top link in the description. Go check out our Discord if you want to check out our Discord hot takes. If you want to be a part of that, much more likely to react to your take there. You're not competing with how many people commented on this one? 450. That's honestly kind of low for what we typically go for. So yeah, check us out on Patreon. Check out our Discord, and peace.